So now we're going to go ahead and tackle Module 5, and we're going to be starting to get a little bit beyond Piaget, which we focused on so much in the first few modules for this chapter. But before we totally leave Piaget, we're going to highlight a kind of complementary theory or observation by Elkind in regards to formal operational thought. And then some of the neo-Piagetians have put forward this idea of post-formal thought to be kind of a next stage or next advancement cognitively in our thinking past the formal operational thought. So you're talking about more adults and their skill sets there. And so let's go ahead and look at Elkind. I really do like Elkind's theories. He put forward this idea of an adolescent egocentrism. Now, if you remember when we were talking back in the pre-operational stage through the issue of centration, or only looking at one perspective at a time, we discussed that with Piaget in his pre-operational stage. In formal operational stage, what Elkind proposed is that we see kind of a reemergence of egocentrism, but the cause of it is different. Whereas a young child can only see their own perspective because basically they don't really have the cognitive capacities to be able to understand others or appreciate others' perspectives. Adolescents are starting to move into a different phase where they're trying to anticipate what others are thinking and doing, but they're not very good at it at the beginning. So adolescent egocentrism in a broad way is where adolescents have difficulty in differentiating their own thoughts and feelings from those of other people. So once again, different than the egocentrism that we see in childhood. And this is manifested in two ways that Elkind kind of highlights here. The first is something called the imaginary audience. And this is where you confuse your own thoughts with those of a hypothesized audience for your behavior. So in other words, you're anticipating how others are going to sense and think about things. And so an imaginary audience, for example, may get you into a little trouble if you have a particular viewpoint and then let's say you tell a very off-color joke that can be quite offensive, but you find very funny. You may make the mistake of thinking that others are going to also appreciate the humor in your joke when they actually don't. So that is one example of an imaginary audience. And you can imagine a lot of times how when adolescents stumble socially, that this may be one of the root causes, is that they confuse their own thoughts and beliefs with those of what others will think too. But they do at least are rudimentarily aware of others and their perspectives. They're just not very good at guessing what their perspectives might be. The next one is the personal fable. And the personal fable is the tendency to think that you and your feelings are unique. And that people who have high scores, adolescents who have high scores on this adolescent egocentrism, tend to behave in riskier types behaviors. And that's because they believe that their feelings, their experiences are totally unique to themselves and not to others. So when you're depressed, you're as depressed as anybody has ever been. Nobody can relate to you. And when you're in love like nobody else. And nobody can possibly understand that. So I've always thought that Shakespeare was rather brilliant when thinking about Romeo and Juliet and making Romeo and Juliet a couple of teenagers. Because if you think about the perspectives of it, if you were older, you probably wouldn't pursue that particular romance. I mean, you meet, you have the attraction, the eyes, everything. You just sync with this other person. And you can't believe it. You're so excited. And then you hear a gunshot in the distance, and your friend has just killed her husband. That may be a non-starter to go with. But if you feel this connection as an adolescent, you might go, well, this may be the only time I feel this type of connection my whole life, and I need to grab this opportunity as soon as possible. So never mind this catastrophic thing. Oh, you're from a family that we have been in generational war with and feuds. Never mind that. This is the connection that we have. It is special. Okay. If you had a couple of 30-year-olds, they would look at each other, sigh, maybe think of what it might have been, but then move on. So the personal fable is not only in regards to love, but it's also in regards to things like depression, anxiety. And so it can be very difficult to overcome. And one of the things, if you ever work with adolescents, that you'd want to try to avoid is saying things like, I know exactly what you're going through. Because their reaction is going to be, no, you don't. You don't possibly know how I feel. How could you feel that? I know that you and dad felt something a long time ago, but I'm in love. And this is something deeper. And they go on. And so it can be hard to kind of break through this idea of the personal fable. It's also why you don't refer to those first romantic inklings as puppy love or crushes, because the adolescents aren't going to be able to relate. So we need to be aware of the personal fable, and especially like doing therapy, when somebody's being depressed, they're going to feel so down. You can't say, well, other people have gone through this. Now, something that seems to kind of work its way through this kind of mentality is being with other individuals roughly the adolescent's same age who are undergoing some of the same difficulties that the adolescent is. And if that's the case, sometimes you can kind of break through that personal fable wall. Okay. So, why they think this occurs? Okay, one of the reasons that I was discussing earlier is that you have to have advanced social perspective taking abilities, and you get that in formal operational thought because you're able to take perspective, go into the future, manipulate that around, anticipate what's going to happen next. And so, it's a really good skill. You got to have it if you're going to succeed as an adult. And you just really have to kind of ease into it. So you start shedding your literalism that you had in your concrete and pre-operational thinking, and now you're thinking in a more abstract way. So one experiment that they did in the early 2000s to kind of illustrate this is that they would go ahead and ask adults and children if you can see with your ears. And children, being very literal, says, well, no, of course not. You don't see through your ears. No. And they got it right. Adults, on the other hand, would often say, well, yeah, you can see with your ears. And of course, they're going metaphorical, which shows a higher level of thinking, but yet get this very literal problem wrong. So, interesting little tidbit there. All right, so that's Elkind and his adolescent egocentrism. Like I say, it's a favorite of mine. I go back to it time and time again. Just it really helps explaining some adolescents' behavior and kind of their reactions to things. So let's move on to the second thing that we are going to discuss in this module, and that is post-formal thought. And when we talk about formal operational thought and particularly post-formal thought, one of the things to know is that education really is the driver here. Those who do not go through advanced schooling and education are unlikely to get to this kind of post-formal thought. And what we usually do, and I talked a little bit about this earlier, is that we tend to not engage in the highest levels of thinking unless we absolutely have to, or it's an area of very high expertise for us. We are mostly concrete thinkers, adults as well as young, adolescents, most of the time, unless we really have an area of expertise or we're really put to the challenge, and then we'll kick it up to this higher level thought because it's just hard thinking. And one of the areas of post-formal thought that they emphasize is relativistic thinking. And this is understanding that knowledge depends on the subjective perspective of the knower. And so, in other words, this is a very academic way of describing relativistic thinking. But what in essence it means is that you got to know that everybody that witnesses an event brings their own past and perspective to that event. And so the event is remembered differently among different people. Okay. And the truth is not with one individual, but probably is somewhere in between all the different perspectives of whatever event was witnessed. Okay. So, the relativistic thinking really needs to be context specific, and post-formal people who engage in post-formal thought realize that the absolute truth is more slippery. It's not just one person's say so. You got to kind of work and dig through things. You also begin to understand that you may not be able to have logically correct answers You've got to be able to understand how people perceive things. So the example I've always used is waiting in a security line for getting onto an airplane. And if you were truly logical about it, I'd say get rid of them. So, think about how many hours that millions of people waste every single day getting screened to go on an airline. And what are the odds that somebody would take over that air flight, bring on a gun, do something like that? They're pretty low. They're pretty low. And so you figure if you gave up, say, 2 or 3 flights a year that end up having a terrorism thing, is that really the equivalent, those lives lost, to all the hours, millions of hours every day that are lost going through these lines? I mean, from a logical perspective, you may be able to see the argument. It's pretty sound, how many hours in an individual lifetime. And if we're wasting millions of those every single day, aren't we essentially killing off individuals waiting in these security lines? Of course, it's spread out over millions of people. It's not one individual's life. And anytime I ask this in person and ask for a raise of hands, well, who would want to go on a plane in that type of world? Nobody raises their hand. They don't want to be the one on that 1 or 2 flights a year that end up crashing. And so the logic of it, and I realize it's a far out kind of perspective. So I know that people need to have at least a veneer of assurance that there is a security apparatus in place. Now, if you ever look at the performance of catching all of the contraband getting slipped through the airplane screening, you probably wouldn't be all that secure. But at least the presence of it and having to spend time going through it can assure you that it's safe enough to go on the plane, and then nothing happens on the plane, which it probably wouldn't even if we didn't go through all the screening. Then people will go ahead and fly. And that's engaging in relativistic thinking, knowing that, yes, in reality, some of these logical explanations and logical solutions to the problem are just not palatable for folks. And it takes people with post-formal thought to totally realize that. When we engage in relativistic thinking, it is usually the best solution to real life problems. And it really acknowledges the idea that there may not be one best fit for or one best answer for a long-standing problem. There may be decent answers, many decent answers to a particular problem, and be able to muddle on through that. And then once again, there is no objective absolute truth because of the subjective perspective of the knower. In other words, all the baggage we bring to anything that we see, and therefore taints any absolute truth that we might have. Okay. The other kind of hallmark of post-formal thought is dialectical thinking. And in dialectical thinking, what you're doing is detecting paradoxes and inconsistencies among ideas. And what you're doing is trying to reconcile them. So I'm not an expert in physics, but I do know that there is a whole physics for small things and a whole physics for big things. And the small things and the big thing physics, they don't mesh. They're totally different. And so a dialectical thinker who knows more about physics than I do would have to try to rectify that by creating a theory where both can coexist because they are true, but how do they blend? How does it work in the grand scheme of things? And that would be kind of like one of your major dialectical type of thought processes. But this could be in any range of other applied fields as you get into and realize that there are two truths, but the two truths don't really back each other up. So how do we deal with that? And dialectical thinkers are going to be able to detect those paradoxes and then reconcile them. Okay. So that's post-formal thought, just a little glimpse of it. And as you can see, much higher level thinking than even we saw in formal operational thought that Piaget proposed. So as we wrap up this module, let's go ahead and just take a look back at Piaget and his contributions. First, giant in the field of development. You really can't go anywhere with cognitive development and not run into Piaget. The man sparked and stimulated tons of research that occurred. It still is happening to this day, even though he's long passed. And it did a good job of describing how children understand. How do they develop that understanding over time, and how does it look a bit different? And so that insight is remarkable. It has a lot of implications for what we do as parents, and certainly what we do in our education system in trying to best utilize how that child thinks and accommodate that. The sequence of stages was also verified. So you go from a pre-operational stage to a concrete operational stage to a formal operational stage, and you don't skip any of those stages. Now, the ages, on the other hand, that may be a little more of one that has challenge. So Piaget wasn't perfect, and he would probably be the first to admit that. He did underestimate the abilities of children. And once again, I think I remarked on this in our early module, that the tasks were just very difficult, sometimes overly complex for illustrating what underlying skill he was trying to measure with children. And other researchers who've put their minds to it have come up with better ways and found out children actually show things like object permanence much earlier than what Piaget had initially thought. Of course, more rudimentary than what Piaget had also seen. He claimed that these broad stages of development exist. However, we know, and what we'll be getting into in Module 6 with Vygotsky, is that culture definitely plays a role. So in other words, context. We have a lot more context-specific development than Piaget believed, and the universality tends to be more limited than before. Development is described but not explained. And so it's more like we're taking pictures and we're describing what's happening, but we don't explain what the underlying mechanisms are. So when we get into our next chapter on information processing, we're going to get into people's efforts at explaining how these changes are occurring that Piaget described. Okay, and then he didn't pay a lot of attention to social influences, which once again in our next module, Vygotsky made that a major part of his particular theory of cognitive development. So, wasn't perfect, but very much worth knowing and continues to influence us even to this day. So in our next module, we're going to be talking about Vygotsky and his sociocultural perspective, so stay tuned.